And now, let's talk about some of the other allies and partners. I mean, obviously, with five nations of considerable might and impact in the world, there is a lot to be said about their strength, but they can't do it alone. So this next category will detail the closest allies of the Big Five, and who are often prominent regional powers and whose interests align with the Big Five, thus culminating in the mutual vision of a safe and secure society. And much like the previous list, this is an alphabetical order, not so much in prominence of strength or power. So starting off, we have the Kingdom of Agalon, whose motto translates to the birthplace of heroes. Agalon is a constitutional monarchy led by Hakima, which is the word for king, and Agalonic, Sikarus III, who was actually born Saif al-Muradi. The Prime Minister of Agalon is known as Himilko Basaredi, and Agalon is actually the largest Lahada nation in Valscoria. In fact, one of two Lahada sovereign states in Valscoria, in part due to the Fateh Sultanate. There are obviously other areas of Valscoria that worship Lahada, but there are no other sovereign entities that do. So a brief history of Agalon. It was first settled by ancient Vescorians and later Maramic Imperials. Maram is an island nation not too far from Agalon and pretty close to Venom and kind of, in fact, the link between Laboca and Valscoria, I would say. So yeah, they were settled by Maramic Imperials, which gave rise to the Maramic language, later known as Agalonic, due to its differences as time would go on. And they would be converted to Lahada by proxy due to Maram's influence on Agalon. And this made it easier for the Fateh Sultanate to come in when in the Fateh's navy, one of the commanders, known as Hayati Burabasi, also known as the son of Marnus, who used the Fateh's navy to conquer over Kisilania, which is the island group which includes Agalon. Following this conquest, after centuries, there was a brief Cantanian invasion, which wasn't as successful, unfortunately, for the Cantanians. They did manage to convert a large sway to dream conjuring, which was interesting. But however, not too long after the Cantanian invasion, Agalon used the momentum of the Cantanian Revolution to declare themselves independent from the kingdom. To declare an independent kingdom from the Fatehs. And as we see in modern times, Agalon is starting to look like a more reliable ally than Cantus, who occupy the same geographic sphere as them. But Agalon also has a more formidable air force of their own to be reckoned with. So that is Agalon in a nutshell. Moving on, Bayonk. Bayonk, I honestly couldn't tell you what their motto translates to. If I had to guess, it's in my defense, Theos I defend. Theos is another word for God, especially in the Theosist religion. Bayonk is a considerably large island country for Mayfield, which is the vast majority of nations in Mayfield are all in the same landmass, but Bayonk and Batilia, which is very similar to Bayonk, exist as separate islands in the southeastern part of the region. And like I said with Batilia and mentioning them just now, they were both once colonies of the Malinka Empire, much like Niteria, who we discussed earlier as well. And Bayonk exhibits a more peaceful disposition, as comes with the territory being associated with Mayfield, but hosts many foreign bases, good for training soldiers and allies of the Big Five in certain and inhospitable weather conditions. And you might be wondering, besides being just friendly besides being friendly to the Big Five, what else do they do? Bayonk actually has a considerably powerful and interesting arms industry. Bayonk actually manufactures and innovates a lot of arms, which then are sold to mainly Big Five client nations. Next, we have Shotkuns. Shotkuns motto translates to the sea, freedom, and Shotkuns is a large nation in north-central Talmere, whose capital is Puglandia, and is a democratic republic led by President Brandosaurus Maximus. The President Brandosaurus Maximus was actually formerly a line cook, and this, I think, exemplifies the unorthodox but hardworking spirit of the average Chalkunsian, who are voter conscious to trust the common man over career politicians. And I think further proof of this is the fact that his ratings have been just going considerably higher as time has gone on with his term. So there you go. Shokun's borders both Nigeria and the Polish Empire, and so as fate would have it, was also part of the Polish Empire. They would get their independence following World War One, but first let me discuss the fact that World War One, at least in Talmer, began in Shokun's when the crown prince of the Polish Empire was shot and killed by a Brokelian nationalist in the city of Pogalandia. And with World War One, and at the crux of their revolution within that war, the liberation of Pogalandia was in fact one of the deadliest conflicts during the war. Shokuns and the citizenry of Shokuns have a keen interest in cybersecurity, which, if you've seen the survey video, which included Shokuns being surveyed, is actually the largest field of study in the nation. Many Shokuns around the world operate in InfoSec corporations, and in fact even foreign governments due to their knowledge of cyber warfare and being more familiar with the territory. Shokuns is also a proud ally of Cantus, who in fact protested when they left the Big Five alliance, but continue to maintain good relations with everyone involved nonetheless. So that is Shokuns for you. Moving on, we have Siginivia, whose motto translates to the Holy Field. So Siginivia has always been an interesting country, a historic battlefield between Danzig Imperials from the west and the Bassarids from the east. Geography. When we talk more about these empires that have influenced Scorian history, namely in Illustrious, these are both two large, formidable powers that briefly coexisted at the same time, but Danzig and its dynasties were more prevalent in ancient history, whereas the Bassarids came later. Ondor Sahad, which is the large island in the north, has less population than the metro area of Toulon, which is the capital city. However, Ondor Sahad is actually home to large oil reserves, which is where the Siginivian nation gets most of its wealth. And the role of Siginivia in the proximity and alliance of the Big Five, in addition to their shared democratic and liberal values, especially for a Lahda country, Siginivia is one of the more liberal Lahda countries in the world. They maintain pressure on anti-Big Five allies in central Illustrious, as well as being a key player in the Katawi War, which is ongoing as we speak. At some point, we will very soon talk about the Katawi War, also known as Slave Raiders, for those of you more familiar with the Scorian lore. So that's Siginivia. Moving on, we have Isla, whose motto, as you can see in Malinka, stronger together, divided we fall. Isla is actually, from a brief measurement recently, was found out to be the largest country by landmass in the world, located in southwestern Casavea. In fact, is considered or nicknamed the kingpin of Casavea, given its size, population, and sway over regional affairs. The nation is led by Grand Chieftain Great Condor, who was born Jonathan Renoidekan, but is also led in the government by Prime Minister Red Squirrel, also known as Ilanaya Migorna. In fact, Isla has the largest legislature in the world, consisting of over 700 elected officials. And so, what is Isla, you might be wondering? It's a grand union or confederacy of several native tribes who are united in the face of uncertainty against foes both foreign and domestic, and in fact continued to remain unified as time went on and formalized itself into statehood sometime in the 190s, with further constitutional amendments 200 years later. In fact, later Isla would form the Casavean Association of Nations from the suggestion of a Cantinian diplomat, and the Can, as it's now known, was used much like the Talmar Union to integrate the region and formalize and make interregional affairs more accessible and give nations in the region better say over how they wish to govern and act among themselves. And Isla also has the largest navy in Casavea, and in fact is projected to be the next naval power in Scoria. This is also where it assists the Big Five, who don't have as big a reach in Casavea as Isla does. In fact, namely effectively capturing evading criminals, namely drug smugglers, which is a huge problem in nations, especially to the north of Isla. So it's safe to say Isla has a lockdown on things that go on within the region, as well as among non-state uh, opponents of the Big Five in Isla. So that's Isla for you. Next, we have Kyrlan. Kyrlan's motto translates to "for Theos and its king and his kingdom." It's not about us. Very humble and religious population, as you can see. Kyrlan is a constitutional monarchy who is the head of state is not listed here, but is Regent Lord Marcin Ivanov, who has been the Regent Lord of Kyrlan for quite some time. So for that reason, I wanted to include the head of government, who is Prime Minister Henrik Högström. Kyrlan is one of the largest nations in Talmare by land area, and it's in the far north. In fact, the far northwest of Talmare. And using its geographic position, it exerts pressure from the Big Five and the Talmare Union onto the bordering states such as Danasa, Ivarkea, and Chevenach. In fact, back in ancient times, Kyrlan was the epicenter and stronghold of the Osmir, who were a collection of cultures that sprang from this geographic area and then stretched into the far corners of the world. So we already kind of briefly discussed their role within the alliance of the Big Five. As far as other more recent history, there were several large battles of World War II that took place, especially in the southern parts of Kyrlan, when the Danasan Union, as it was known, invaded Kyrlan and in fact set up a rump state of extremists to further incite insurgency and chaos in Kyrlan. But luckily this didn't last as long, and as you can see, Kyrlan's back in one piece, ever vigilant and free and peaceful as ever. Moving on, Cardvemia. Cardvemia is located in south-eastern continental Vasuna, and whose motto, despite being very intimidating and long to say, translates to "Great sacrifices were made to preserve our nation." In fact, I don't think any motto for a nation could be truer than that. Cardvemia is a constitutional monarchy led by King Larash II, and also representing the government by Prime Minister Rachel Voku. Cardvemians practice Megalos Judicianism. Judicianism is a large faith in continental Vasuna, one of two large faiths in continental Vasuna, and this branch of this faith was part of the reason for their secession and I guess you could say identity crisis, which inspired them to revolt and make a name separate from the Judicani state as it was back then. So Pyrrhic warfare granted the Cardvemians their freedom and the power to formally end the Thousand Years' War, a religious war of disastrous proportion that raged across the region. And so we will talk more about the Thousand Years' War at some other point in the future, but it's important to touch on to see the context of who are the Cardvemians and where they come from. But their role within the Big Five and their alliance is to enforce mutual agreements from the Big Five into the Vasuna Cooperative, sort of the regional union, so to speak, and to put pressure on otherwise hostile states such as Ukraine and the Cardia Federation. Next, we have Malinka. Malinka's motto, in plain Malinkan, "Glory to the Crown." Very proud royalist sentiment there, even to this day. And that's because Malinka was once home to the largest empire in the world. The Malinkan Navy, especially in medieval times, was a formidable force to be reckoned with. In fact, if you went up the Malinkan Navy, it was basically certain death, especially considering the large swath of territory that they controlled at their peak. Malinka is, like other nations in this list, a constitutional monarchy led by King Joseph III of the House Grenwald, and in the government, which is elected, is represented by Prime Minister Arthur Morrington. So as we said, Malinka was once home to the largest empire in Scoria, and their colonies and colonial efforts transpired in many of the countries, in fact, already listed. However, those days are long past, and now Malinka exists as a faithful and supportive ally of the Big Five. So a very interesting, but not surprising, shift in ideology, seeing as in fact Malinka was actually home to democratic institutions as it maintained its empire, seeing it as sort of a survival necessity. See, because if you had one king making authoritative decisions for millions and millions of people across the world, I don't think it would have ended well personally. So it was very necessary for Malinka to introduce autonomy and home rule in many of its, loyalist colonies. Malinka is also the spiritual head of Hranic Catholic Theosism, which after the island of Hrana was transformed or succumbed to Northern Orthodoxy and the resurgence of the Lankoru faith, the Malinkan Empire took it upon itself to recrown itself as the spiritual head for that large branch of Theosism. And that is also Malinka in a nutshell for you. Boom. Moving on to Boca, we have Nidowai, whose motto translates to the protectors of the word of God. Nidowai is a large, diverse nation that which exists in a region known as the Horn of the Boca. You can see like this tipped area up here is actually on the coast, and this forms the horn, which goes down into this part, which is also coastal, known as the Cave of Hex. Nidowai was the historic center of Teleku Nidi, which is a large empire ruled by god kings that came from this nation and spanned the Horn of the Boca into the Keep of Hex before the Faltez Sultanate was formed. In fact, when I say god kings there, it's sort of a word lost in translation, equating a similar idea as the pharaohs, which the pharaohs ruled over ancient Aranka, which isn't too far from Nidowai. And so this idea of immortal and deity monarchs came over with them. The leader of Nidowai is ruled. Oh my God. The leader of Nidowai is King Bekumbuso Tazdinawi, and whose prime minister is Hamdadegu Iyasu, and she leads the democratically elected assembly in Nidowai. Nidowai was formerly ruled by the Vedians, as we discussed with Vedenum, shortly until the end of the Second World War, as well as sorry, let me just recollect myself real quick. Gosh. So Nidowai was formerly ruled by the Vedians until shortly after the Second World War, where they got their independence with the formal dissolution of the Vedian Empire, which then gave rise to the constitutional monarchy, which then formed today. Nidowai is also the largest adherent of Soctematic Theosism, which is arguably the oldest branch of Theosism, which dates back even further, before the before the schism, which divided Orthodoxy and Catholicism. In fact, an interesting fact about the Soctematic Church is a church in Didesa, which is one of the largest cities in Nidowai, is guarded by who are known as the Veiled Virgins. And this church houses the Barge of the Pact, which houses relics and ancient texts sacred to both the Lankoru and Theosis faiths. It's often said if you open this barge, it'll basically melt your face off. So that's a very unpleasant thing to happen, and they're very protective of their religious sites, which exist all over the nation. Nidowai fought tooth and nail against the Solgari and even Kalantricine forces to preserve its modern borders. So after the Scoria Empire dissolved in Luboka, it was up to Nidowai to defend itself and its territories, core territories that constituted Nidowaian groups, important and protected under their sovereignty. In fact, it's often believed that their guerrilla warfare tactics were first observed by the Big Five, dating back to prior to the Lubokan War, and are still used to this day. So there's Nidowai. Boom. Moving on, we have Ramdan, Ramdan's motto translates to peace and serenity. A very simple, very sweet motto. Ramdan is one of two Suvak majority nations. Suvak is a rather new religion which sprang out of Ramdan, actually sprang out of Ramdan. And it's because of this they were under the reign of Samandar before seceding in the 180s DE, forming the modern nation of Ramdan before they were briefly occupied and colonized by the Vedian Empire. Sorry, I didn't mention the other Suvak majority nation. It's Shigari, which is the mainland of Vistuna. And following Ramdan's independence, they supported the Princes of Peace, which was a faction during the Samundari Civil War. They were pro-democratic and separatist movements within Samundar, effectively balkanizing the island of Samundar and giving them the borders we see today. Ramdan is also an educational hub, and in fact houses the largest rate of tertiary education in Vistuna, as many Ramdani students go on to become skilled white-collar workers, including doctors, surgeons, and professors. And in modern times, Ramdan continues to use its influence and promises of the Big Five members to exert pressure on Batundara, who Batundara are the remains of the unified Samandari government and still house a lot of those hostile ideologies, and as well as Ramdan wants to shift their influence into Vistuna in resolving hostilities as peacefully as possible. Moving on, we have Royalis. Royalis' motto translates to doing the most to secure a better future. Royalis is a constitutional monarchy led by King Vestillo Manza Montenegro, who in fact recently took over after the previous king of Royalis abdicated not too long ago. The nation is also led in the government by Prime Minister Bartomeu Silaz, and Royalis is a flourishing island nation, almost considered to be technocratic, given its promotion of innovation and entrepreneurship and science. Royalis also exhibits the most scenic and wild natural vistas, coupled with sleek and neon-glazed metropolitan areas. In addition to Catalanis, which is the national language, they speak Nigerian and Hirdlandic, and in fact have one of the largest Hirdlandic expat populations ever. In fact, maybe the largest outside of Kyrlan. And you might be wondering, what is Catalanis? It was a language largely spoken in the southern coastal regions of Bahio prior to the discovery of Royalis, which thus encouraged further Catalanic immigration. And the role within the Big Five as an ally, so while Royalis is largely a neutral state, it's in their best interest, as with their motto, to secure a better future and a peaceful one at that. It's because of their proximity in the middle of the Merchant's Ocean, closer to Illustrious and Vistuna, but also in the middle, across from Talmer. They do a great job of securing international shipping lanes, and in fact, Royalis is often one such stop for vessels of any of the three regions who are crossing the Merchant's Ocean to stop in, and Royalis uses that to inspect their ships before moving out, making sure everything is a-okay. And this last slide will just detail briefly, looking ahead, what's in the future for the Big Five as the timeline goes on, and how will they be transformed and evolve as an alliance. So we briefly discussed the Slave Raiders conflict. That's an ongoing conflict right now in southern Illustrious. Essentially, corporate militias are taking over natural resources in the northern part of Hakatao, and it's not okay with the Big Five. And what they're doing is, the reason it's called Slave Raiders is because of their use of indentured servitude, basically slaves, to carve out and gather these resources illegally. So it's a ragtag team of the Big Five, in addition to Siginivia, who we discussed, as well as some unlikely allies such as the state of Basir, in order to combat these corporate militias who are enslaving people. And then looking ahead from there, 10 or 20 years from the current year in the timeline, is the Hellenic War, which will then transform this alliance into the Big Seven, and that'll include 2 more members of the Big Five lineup, and then becoming the Big Seven. And then in the far distant future, this Big Seven alliance will then transform into the 16 Cooperative, which, as the number insinuates, will include 16 nations in addition to those 7 already present, as equal partners in footing with a say as to what goes on and what should transpire in the world. And so that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them down in the comments. If you'd like to see these live as part of our World Building Wednesdays, you could watch me at twitch.tv/Mazarim. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed, and see you in the next one.